So again, we are live streaming, so thank you for your patience as we did a setup. If we could get back to our seats, we're about to start. This panel discussion is about accelerating emerging technology in government. So again, my name is Karina, Homme. I'm very excited to have the pleasure of talking to everyone here today. You know, I think it's always best when people introduce themselves. So I think my first question is, please tell us about yourself and your role in accelerating emerging technology in government, and what does it really mean to you?
So my name is Sujit Mohanty. I'm the CTO for our DoD business here at Microsoft. A little bit about myself. Kind of born and raised in the DC area, just been living and breathing from the vendor side a lot of these different technologies, and it's been just an amazing journey at this particular point in time where we just look at how emerging technology is being incorporated into not just the federal government, but even just the commercial sector. I think we're just in a world where we're having an explosion of different amounts of data. So we just think of the amount of edge devices, even in this room, that we're surrounded with. And we just think about that information that's being pushed out from these different types of devices. And how do we use that? How do we make insights into it? And so I think a lot of government agencies are starting that journey, and some of the technologies we'll talk about over the next 30 minutes or so. But everything from things like artificial intelligence to machine learning. You saw a demonstration just a couple of minutes ago, what can be done from an edge perspective. But in addition to things with augmented reality and virtual reality, there's a lot of insights that can actually be gleaned. So it's a very exciting time right now.
Hi, I'm Julie McReynolds. I'm a product manager.
I'm not sure your mic's on.
Yeah, trade chat. Okay. Hi, I'm Julie McReynolds. I'm a product manager at the US Digital Service, currently working with some teams at HHS. If for those that aren't familiar with USDS, we are a group of technologists, mostly that come from the private sector, to serve what we call tour of duty inside of government, to try to bring private sector best practices in technology to government. It's a weird job. Sometimes it's a really hard job. And I have to admit that when I was asked to come sit on this panel and talk about emerging technology, I had a little internal chuckle, because a lot of what our group does is just try to get a lot of government systems up to what everybody else in the world would think of as the norm. So we're still dealing with trying to get rid of 23,000 paper forms inside of the federal government, working on critical systems inside of agencies that are 8 million lines of COBOL and living on 15 mainframes. So we talk about these things and we talk about emerging technology, but in a lot of cases, we're trying to get agencies ready to a place where they are building modern digital services and then can be in a position to take advantage of what we are now thinking of as emerging technology.
All right, my name is Meagan Metzger. I'm the CEO and founder of Dcode, and this is where my love is, because we are an IT accelerator. So our sole mission is to work with the private sector emerging technologies that are just changing so rapidly, and it's really, really hard for the government to keep up. And how do we help those technologies get into the government environment so the government can transform their missions with those technologies? And so there's two theories. One is it's really hard. I mean, everyone in this room has probably lived one side of the fence or the other. So if we're a new company, an AI company, for example, trying to break into the government, the barriers to entry are just so incredibly high that a lot of them turn away from the market altogether, which doesn't do the government any service. And the flip side of that is the government actually, I've generally found, wants access to these emerging technologies, but also there's a barrier in the reverse. Call it procurement, call it ATOs, call it all the things that we know well. So we sit right there in between those groups, and we run 5 accelerators a year. and they're centered around different themes. So we've covered 9 different topics that range from AI and advanced analytics to blockchain to things like cloud. To your point, that's still very innovative for the government, with the idea that if these technologies can come into the market faster, then the government can benefit at a much faster rate, and we can get not only to the current state, but then keep going and get to the future before all of our adversaries do and all of our citizens have an uproar. So that's me.
What she just said is what I'm trying to do in the inside of the DoD. So Defense Innovation Unit had been experimental. Now we've dropped the X from our title because we've been around for a couple of years, and it's proven to be a model that works because it's addressing a real gap. And as I think about our pace of adoption of technology versus our near peer and peer adversaries, we're not doing very well. And you can see that reflected in the National Defense Strategy, and kind of the mood in the Pentagon is that we are being outpaced significantly, and it's some of the technology areas that we'll talk about here that'll come up. So it's a bit of there's some urgency on fixing that. It's a procurement issue. It's an accreditation and a security issue, especially in the IT and the cloud realm, but it is a significant issue, and it's just getting worse. So Defense Innovation Unit, we operate across 5 different portfolio areas: artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, IT, cyber, human systems, and space, trying to get access to technologies that are highly stable from a technology readiness level and highly commercialized or commercializable. And the theory is that if we can get at those technologies that the commercial industry has already made significant efficiencies around, then the government doesn't have to pay for all internal research and development like it had in yesteryear getting technologies to that level. So this industry is a perfect example of incredible government bargains to be had if we can do the procurement right, but there's a lot of getting it right, which means getting out of our own way, and a lot of that is built into law and procurement regulation and other things that are very difficult to deal with.
So just a question. So I did start out, what does it mean to you, what emerging tech? So what's hot in emerging tech? And I think I heard there's 2 sides of emerging tech: what's out there in the commercial realm, and then what is hot of emerging tech in government.
So I typically, this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but almost divide the government into 2 different camps. So we have one where going to the cloud and going to mobile and edge devices is actually very innovative and very emerging. And then we have other parts of the government that are doing shark laser beams, artificial intelligence, and some of that. So you'll see a very wide range. I'm of a big mindset that a lot of it is focused right now on, you can't run artificial intelligence on Excel spreadsheets. So we need to get our data to the right place. We need to get into the cloud. We need to be able to handle the volume of data, train the data, clean the data, and do all of that preparation so that we can leverage some of the AI tools that are available. So I think there's going to be a big push on that in the in the next several years. The data problem is very large, as was mentioned earlier. But then you have some of the buzzwords. So you'll see blockchain quite a bit, and I think there are some really fantastic applications of blockchain in the government, but right now we see a lot of tech tourism around blockchain. And then, there's other pockets. We're actually running a space accelerator right now, kind of because you'll see there's over 12 agencies that are procuring next generation space technologies. So still I put a big vote for the advanced analytics, and AI is kind of one of the really big pushes that's both sexy and very applicable.
So curious, of all the pilots collectively that you do, how many are successful and actually come to fruition? And what are those use cases?
Hand the microphone to me. I would say at DIU, we exist under the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering alongside DARPA, Missile Defense Agency, Strategic Capabilities Office, all the federally funded research development institutions. And so we have a kind of a lower expectation of success demand. In other words, we're afforded an opportunity to fail more frequently, I think, because, fail meaning, if you're going to try to adopt a technology in a pace and get it into a system that's going to have a sustained advantage over an adversary, you're going to have to bear some risk. And so failing, a third of the time or 2/3 of the time may well be acceptable. in terms of what are kind of the hot things, the SecDef, and then Dr. Griffin, who is Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, has outlined there are 5 mission areas that are the focus, and then 5 technology areas. So fully networked C3, space offense and defense, missile defense, cybersecurity, and nuclear modernization are the anointed mission areas that the entire DoD research and engineering apparatus is being focused on. The technologies that enable that are hypersonics, directed energy, machine learning AI, quantum computing, and microelectronics. So we have a really some clear guidance from the top of the DoD channels on what are the priorities to plug our national security threat gaps.
And I think just from the vendor side to share Microsoft research, and from an R&D perspective, we spend billions just on investments in trying new experiments and rapidly trying to take innovation and actually trying to hyperscale or actually come out with something that could actually be used by the overall broader market. So an example of that was something called Azure Sphere. So this came out actually of a paper that a researcher named Galen Hunt wrote roughly about 3 years ago. And it was basically around 7 key points around microcontroller architectures. So being able to secure microcontrollers, control the supply chain, being able to ensure that you had consistency around delivery of these edge-type devices, these chips that are going to these edge devices. And so in turn, a reference architecture came out from it, and we actually built an entire product line from it. So you've got the ability to use this Azure Sphere service, which is available to multiple chip manufacturers. It's open sourced. There's a Linux-based operating system that came out of it. So this is an example of just one piece of innovation where we actually took something from the research side and actually now made it available to our customers in order to leverage in a lot of just different devices in today's world. But I think the key point that you mentioned also, not just from the government side, but also the commercial side, is being able to rapidly innovate, try and experiment, and it's okay to fail. Understand that you have to be in a learning mode. And what I mean by that is you've got to be able to understand that if things can actually fail, you can learn from it and actually use it for your next innovation or your next iteration. Because not everything is a success. But if you could rapidly do that, you can continuously build value and build innovation and hyperscale that as required.
Yeah, I might add, over the last 2.5 years, we've accelerated about 60 technologies. Right now, there's 42 implementations going on across the government, and there's not really one clear topic area of what's being adopted and what's being really sticky. We find that it does vary from DoD to the IC to the civilian agencies. But we are seeing a large uptick. I would say in this past year, security has been such a huge thing, and a lot of it is related to cloud and cloud migration and cloud security and access management into those services such as Microsoft. And we've actually, some of our stickier technologies came out of our DevOps cohort. So how do we enable USDS to actually allow these really talented coders on their tour of duty to come in and be able to function and do their job with modern software development technologies? So CDCI tools, things that are related to the GitHubs and things like that of the world also tended to become very sticky, but a lot of it's really centered around getting your stuff up into the cloud. But I don't know what you're seeing from the USDS perspective.
So first I want to start with, I'm so jealous of the stuff that you get to play with at DoD. You're making me want to go jump to the Defense Digital Service to work with them. So I do a lot of work with HHS, primarily with CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. There's not a lot of experimentation with technology that goes on there because you're talking about the largest single payer in our country's healthcare machine. So you're dealing with a lot of lives, you're dealing with a lot of money, and if that thing starts to collapse in any way, then the whole country is in trouble. And you're not just talking about people's lives, you're talking about our economy. So that's not an agency where they are going to be prone to experimentation with new technology. They are coming around to recognizing that they have to modernize the technology that they have. And so we do spend a lot of time talking about how do you start to move services to the cloud and off of the many, many mainframes that you're maintaining. And data centers, and how can you be more flexible? It's not super exciting, cutting edge work, but without the work that's happening there, then none of this other stuff is possible. So I would say cloud. Just, we spend a lot of time actually just explaining the cloud still.
Yeah, I mean, that was the question that came to mind, is what are the strategies you're using to modernize these systems and to get it into...
So I'll use an example of the Medicare payment system. We have recently launched a project with CMS to look at how can you modernize that Medicare payment system. So some numbers to understand about the payment system. It's actually 4 systems. Collectively, you're talking about 16 million lines of COBOL, about 5 million lines of assembly across all of these systems. It's about 50 years old. And they're obviously very hesitant to try. You can't go after that wholesale and just do something. The amount of money that passes through that out to providers accounts for almost 4% of our GDP. So it's a big critical system. And so what we're doing to help them look at modernization of that is actually building small services of parts and mimicking parts of the COBOL that exists, putting it on the mainframe to make sure that it works, and then we take that small thing, move it up to the cloud, and then put an API in front of it, so then it behaves more like what we think of as a modern digital service. But you have to do that in a very sort of careful way, because you can't take out any one part of the existing system. So it's very methodical, slow kind of work that has to happen. To CMS's credit, they recognized that it was better to start addressing that work now than to wait another 10 or 15 years for that system to actually become a problem, because it works fine now. It's not a problem, but they have become forward thinking enough to recognize that it's better to do the work now than to wait for a problem to occur.
And I think a question to all, how are you working in that private-public partnership, and what points can we do more collaboration together to get to the end result?
We'll all just look at each other. So, I mean, I'm a really big believer that the two parties need to come together. Right now, a lot of times you hear this really big push for, you know, the government to start behaving more like a metaphysical Silicon Valley company, and the government saying, hey, the technologies need to bend to us, you know, in order for us to be effective. And I actually think the answer is somewhere right in the middle. You know, it really starts with being transparent and having open discussions about what the actual mission and the actual problems are. You know, from the outside looking in, if you're new to government, it's not as clear as a lot of times the government thinks it is on what their actual technology needs are. So being able to explain those in a way to the emerging technology community, and this is one thing that DIU does very well, is in a way that they can understand and actually collaborate and take feedback, because the government's still very accustomed to our procurement process and saying, build me this very specific rocket ship with this color and this label on the top, when there's actually companies that are legitimately using centrifugal force to hurl things into outer space. So we're still defining our requirements in terms of what we think we need instead of what we actually want at the end product. So I think that's the starting place, is more open and collaborative discussion with the emerging technology and the government community to find a middle ground and see what the art of the possible actually is.
I would agree, and I think we're sitting here in 1776, and tech incubator, innovation collision zones like this are springing up all over the country. The Army has just established the Army Futures Command in Austin, Texas, with that very intention in mind, and it's in downtown Austin, at a place called Capital Factory, whose business model is not dissimilar to 1776 unit, and organizations like Dcode that are trying to increase the level of interaction and appreciation for what a government procurement person deals with on the government side, and what a technology, especially the small, non-traditional, perhaps faster moving companies that can bring a technology to market much more quickly. Those are the kinds of things that I think can really serve us well, and I'm seeing a lot more of those across the country.
And I guess probably just a last thing to close that out. One thing from the private side, going back to the government and vice versa, is just the talent gap that exists just inside of the government. A lot of it's coming from contracted bodies and external vendors. So I think some of the agencies have been investigating the idea of using a public-private talent exchange, being able to have people from private industry go into federal government and actually do kind of like a tour, at least for a year or 2 years, actually bring some of their knowledge, work on 1 or 2 mission-specific programs or projects, and then be able to go back to their company. But in turn, they've actually enriched a lot of and do the flip from the government side and actually have them work on 1 or 2 or more programs inside of a private industry partner or a company, and actually bring that knowledge back to the government. And so in turn, you're actually able to cross-pollinate some of the culture. And I think organizations like USDS, 18F, DIU have actually done a fantastic job just in those early stages of starting to set that groundwork in order to get that ball rolling.
Well, you started it, so let's talk about workforce and skills. We've talked a lot about as we release a new service every 37 hours, how difficult it's really to keep up the pace of continual learning at the individual level. I've experienced it of, oh no, there's one more thing I'm going to have to learn today. So how are we doing that in government? How are we attracting talent and being able to take an innovation all the way through to new capability? What are some strategies that we can use?
I'll start with one that I've been impressed with the Army in doing, and that is, all through the years there have been direct commissioning programs for very scarce but super important skill sets, like lawyers, like physicians at time of war. They'll be brought into the military at the first lieutenant or captain level. The Army has a new program. We actually brought in as a lieutenant colonel a cyber professional, one of the world's foremost cyber professionals. As a lieutenant, it took me 18 years to get to lieutenant colonel, but this individual had the cyber skill set that the government needs. So I think it's putting down sort of presumptions on coming through the ranks and checking this block and that block, whether it's as a government civilian or as a military person, in order to move up the ranks, and just saying, hey, what is the scarcest skill set that we are lacking, and how do we attract that kind of talent, and what kind of flexibility can we show? So the government has an inherent limitation on money, right? But there are other mechanisms to meet that. So I think it's about getting a little more creative about accessing talent.
So attracting talent is something that USGS deals with on literally a daily basis. As I mentioned, we're on a tour of duty model, and it is hard for us to find people who are willing to come to DC and do this work. And as hard as it is for us, and we offer what a lot of people would consider a much less rigid environment than what you're going to find inside of most agencies. I go to work in jeans and a hoodie most days, and you're definitely not going to get that somewhere else. But when you look at how other agencies are trying to hire people directly in, there are a lot of sort of just problems in that hiring process. They're not, the people who are doing the hiring aren't necessarily technical, so they don't really know how to assess those skills in candidates. But beyond that, it's hard to get people to want to come and do this if they don't happen to have sort of the mission-driven personality, which I think becomes a very important factor when you start to try to look at how do you hire technical people inside of government. If those people are not driven by some kind of mission, they want to do good things, they want to help people, they want to deliver better services, it's going to be very hard, because you don't come to government to make a lot of money or to become famous in any way, right? You come to government because you think that you can make a difference. And so you just sort of start to narrow down what is already a tough market for hiring, even if you're in the private sector.
And there's actually a lot of waivers and exceptions when it comes to hiring that some of them are very well known and some of them are not. So you have the Presidential Innovation Fellows. There's some, I know DIU leverages, is it special government, special, yeah.
So there are two highly qualified experts and special government employees, two programs that can take scarce skill sets and bring them in as government employees.
Yeah, and so you see a lot of that, and I think one of the, attracting talent, you can attract the mission-driven folks. I think keeping it is something that the government really needs to think about. And there's some very basic things like, when you come from the private sector and then your first government job, you turn on your computer and go get coffee and a bagel and you come back and your computer's still turning on. There's some basic things that are just very different, and the culture will need to evolve a little bit if we're going to actually retain some of that talent, because you can't do the bonuses and the back massages and the free food that the private sector is doing right now. But especially, I think there are some actual policies and procedures that need to change from, kind of driven from an OPM level in order to attract better tech talent and have different job categories that are labeled and identified as such, so that you can bring in data scientists. I think that's where one of our big gaps is going to be, and it is now and continues to be, is around the data science field, because it doesn't matter how many contractors we have that are qualified data scientists. If we don't have government individuals that are able to look at algorithms or look at data sets and identify whether or not there's bias built into it, and are we training them correctly, we're still going to be behind. So, looking at some of those policies and then leveraging waivers and exceptions where we can, I think are going to be critical.
So we all know about Uber. At least I take an Uber probably every other day, and it's really reshaped business, the whole shared economy. How do you see technology reshaping, once we get through IT modernization, some of the basics, how is it going to reshape government? What will government look like in the future?
So I think probably just a couple key things from a technology standpoint is being able to ensure that you have proper service to the citizens. So being able to just engage with newer forms of mobile, being able to have those digital services that citizens demand, that's one of the most important things. So when you have these emerging technologies, being able to leverage them, so you're actually being able to handle your constituents' needs. The other side, too, is also for things from a mission perspective. So when you think of what the DoD needs, being able to leverage, as we talked about from the demonstrations around the vast amounts of information that's occurring, how can I use technologies like artificial intelligence, being able to pre-process things at the edge, being able to leverage cloud-based delivery models, and being able to actually use all that in order to actually solve real mission value needs as required. I think there's always a possibility of having emerging technologies, if they're not properly thought through as far as the value that you're trying to achieve and extract, they can always go sideways. So you've got to actually have that goal in mind. So being able to actually have that, underlying point that you're trying to drive home be critical before you actually start implementing an emerging tech.
I'll throw one out, and I'm very gratified that it came up today, and that is simply subscription-based services and a service level model that is seeping its way into the procurement system, to the point that Microsoft talks about a box that 10 or 15 years ago would have to be purchased and maintained by an IT staff that are either military or contractor, and now it's I'll take it, I want it this month, not next month. I want the capacity. So I think that's a significant step forward, because it's the ability to burst into business cases that are robust and have economies of scale and are global, right? Which is really important, because wherever the U.S. military goes to fight, hopefully it's not going to be the home game, right? It's going to be away from our shores. That is one of the things that I worry about too, though, which is things are hard in kind of a garrison, steady state, peacetime environment like we're in now, because the cyber threat is very real. What happens if we have to fight the away game, right, in Eastern Europe? Are the networks going to be there to support us when we need to do our business in a forward projected location when we have very little time to set up? We've gotten really spoiled of 14 or 15 years sitting fat, dumb, and happy in big forward operating bases in Afghanistan that have had mostly contractor delivered services and air supremacy and space supremacy and lots of other things. So I guess kind of a twofold thing. Subscription-based services, the government loves it. It seems that we're evolving to a way to really leverage those. But I do worry about that doomsday scenario of going at it with a peer adversary, and the systems that we're assuming are going to be there are going to be there for us.
But add on to the subscription-based software, I think that's definitely a trend that's continuing. I think a lot of the systems integrator community is going to start seeing a big shift in the way that their business models operate, because there's actually something we saw on recently on FBO is a $10 million sole source to build a custom identity authentication solution from scratch that they probably could have bought for $150K off the shelf and modified for very little money. So I think that we will start to see a shift in how the integrators have to operate and adopt emerging technologies and provide services on top of those instead of building a lot of custom solutions, because the technology evolves so fast and it's so cheap to start a company now because of things like Microsoft Azure. You can spin up a software company in a week if you wanted to. So I think we will see a shift there. Some of the other things that I'm actually excited about are just pure efficiencies, to be honest with you. We have amazing uses of AI, and some, especially over in the DoD, but some of the ones that I think will stick first are going to actually be allowing humans to do human jobs instead of spending a lot of time with things that machines could handle, like copying and pasting Excel spreadsheets and doing some of the tasks that AI solutions and bots can actually take over for us. So I'm hoping we see kind of an uptick in the efficiency.
Well, there are a lot of other questions I'd love to ask you, and I do want to open the floor for everyone here to ask you their questions. But before I do so, if you were to give any advice on how anyone here could support the adoption of emerging tech in government in a tweet, what would that be? I gave you guys forewarning that I would ask.
So I've got 140 characters or less, right? So 280. Okay. So in a nutshell, I would say having a learning mindset, not one that sets a status checking sort of way of being able to peg your organization. You want to be able to learn, fail fast, fail quickly, and be able to iterate and make that a continuous process. And then the final point, probably at the end of that sentence, or the next sentence, would be try to scale that through your organization and do it methodically as you can. What I mean by that on the whole is that it's very easy to try to use things like continuous innovation and being able to do lean startup, but how do you think about it through your entire org? And so if you could constantly learn, constantly listen to your people, constantly look at the experiments that you're trying to do, you're going to be able to learn and do amazing things around it, being able to enable and leverage emerging tech to the rest of your organization and to the mission that you're trying to achieve.
USGS.gov/join. I'm only half joking when I say that. You should definitely go check it out. But I would say to people who aren't in government, who are trying to work with agency partners and people in government, maybe the most important thing you can do is be patient. Definitely show up and talk about the technology and talk about the benefits of using those things, but understand that not all of those places are going to be ready to adopt them, and that you may have to keep sharing and keep talking about the importance of it to get them in a mindset where they're going to be ready to have a serious conversation and to do the work that it takes to get ready to adopt some of these things.
I would say think big, but start small. Just do something and repeat it often. So you don't have to wait for IT modernization to complete before we start thinking about the next technologies. We can identify what that future state needs to look like, pick a small system, pick a small application, try prototyping it in the cloud, prove that it works, and when you prove it works very quickly with things like MVPs, and we can talk about that later, you get more buy-in. And the more you iterate in smaller chunks, the more buy-in you get, the more you're likely to scale. So start small and iterate often.
I'll borrow a story from our new director, Mike Brown, who was the CEO of Symantec before he was a Presidential Innovation Fellow, and now is our director in our Silicon Valley office. And occasionally we have interactions with the Secretary of Defense. And so Mike Brown related to the team in an all-hands recently that before Secretary Mattis, he had a number of people in there who were presenting him different ideas, and each one he stopped before they started and said, before you talk about what you're about to talk about, tell me what problem you think you're going to fix. So I would say stay focused on the solution, right? And because buying gunpowder or buying tank parts, government procurement official can be very prescriptive in what they need. But if the vendor side of that equation isn't in the I'm going to help you fix the problem, and I'm going to tell you what problem I'm trying to fix, and if I'm wrong, you need to tell me back what problem you're wanting me to help you with. Unless that dialogue can occur in an iterative sequence, you're really not as helpful as you could be. So figure out what problem you think you're trying to solve.
Great, thank you. So let's open it up to questions on the floor. Okay. We'll start here.
Hi, great panel. I wanted to ask you if you had any insights or thoughts about the pace of innovation by our foreign competitors, like China. They're producing patents at 3 times the rate that we are when it comes to AI. And so I'm wondering if other countries might have a better model for innovation, or they're accelerating innovation faster than we are, or is America still have the best innovation model?
I'll throw out a quick we don't have a society that allows us to pilfer and steal and conduct corporate espionage at a national level. So we're not really on a level playing field with some of our adversaries. Doesn't mean we don't have to keep up. And like I said, in my opening remarks, I think we need to find other ways to gain access to the most creative industrial base on the face of the earth, to turn what is an asymmetric advantage on their side to something that we are inherently better at here. But yeah, you're right. That is very concerning.
Yeah, so we've worked with several international companies. My first reaction was very similar, which is China has the ability to test facial recognition on citizens entering buildings and crossing the street and putting their names up on billboards if they jaywalk. We don't have that ability, right? But there are, I think our innovation economy is very strong, but I look at, Australia and Canada, for example, have incredible tax incentives for companies to do R&D inside their own corporations. We're running space technologies right now, and I know launch capabilities are twice as fast and half the cost in a lot of other countries. Some of them are close allies of ours, and some of them are not. So I think there's really strong benefits of starting and building innovation and emerging technologies in America, and I think there's a lot of room for opportunity for us as a country to provide better services to those emerging technologies in the startup community to thrive.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I'd say is just the things that would keep us back from actually being able to be in that #1 position is really that talent gap. And the other thing, just being able to take private industry innovation and get it into the hands of our folks in the government, and just being able to streamline things from procurement. Those are the kinds of things that just need to be sped up in order to keep that innovation angle really in our side as a country.
I do want to mention one thing, because I know I've been a little bit of a Debbie Downer about the whole emerging tech thing, so sorry. But I do want to say that there are things that are happening inside of some agencies right now that are really meant to try to change the structure of some regulations to enable more innovation. For example, at the FDA, they are looking at how can you create a category of medical devices, software as a medical device, and sort of certify or pre-approve a company and their processes, and can they be trusted, and do you think they're going to develop the right thing and put it on the market, instead of having them go through the current sort of very rigid, very onerous process of getting a medical device or a piece of software that might act as a medical device into the market. So they're trying to do these things to, it's not really loosening the regulations, it's just re-looking at them from a more modern angle, right? Those regulations are there to keep people safe and alive when you're talking about medication or medical devices, but because of them, and I've worked in that field, you can bankrupt a company if you touch the wrong thing inside of a piece of software, and it has to go through a round of FDA approval. And so the FDA is really trying to look at those things and think about, are there better ways to get software and devices out into the market and let companies do what they're good at, which is innovate with technology.
Hi, I'm Paul Heron with Snowflake Computing. So I'm coming from the vendor side. And as a big data cloud data warehouse as a service vendor, the biggest impediment we see to adoption of technology that many agencies are standing in line waiting for is the FedRAMP ATO process. It seems to be a holdover from the on-premises mainframe world, and it just has not yet been brought kicking and screaming into the cloud economy. So I'd like to find out what's being done to put pressure on them to drag it kicking and screaming into this world, because it's really standing in the way of the adoption of things that we really benefit the agencies, the government as a whole.
I hear some applause in the back of the room. So trust me when I say that the people inside of government who are trying to work on their own software feel all of the pain of FedRAMP and the ATO process as well. I will say, and this is sort of tangentially related to what I was just talking about with the FDA, there are CIOs inside of various agencies who are starting to look at sort of a similar approach. As their internal groups are working on software and they have to go through that ATO process, they're starting to try to figure out, can they look at the development process? Can they see what are the gates on this thing? Are they defining requirements in a way that makes sense? Are they acting in an agile way? What does the testing look like? So can you ATO the process instead of ATO the end product of the process? So that kind of thinking is starting to happen, and that's really encouraging, because I think if you can move to a world where you're really thinking about how the work is being done and you're placing the trust in the people to do the right work, you can get past a lot of these things, which are, yes, a holdover from a world of really bad waterfall development.
Yeah, so you're speaking my language mostly because I live this pain 60 times a year. So, we have some of the technologies that have come through our accelerator are, some of the largest users of Microsoft on the commercial side and haven't touched government for this reason. So I can't say exactly what they're doing. I know that they're actually very cognizant of the problem because we engage with them often, and they come into our cohorts and they talk to everybody to kind of educate both on the FedRAMP process and for us to complain. I say that tongue in cheek, provide actual constructive feedback, because I think the intention is good. The execution was never really meant to be this 18-month process. FedRAMP tailored is something to look into. It's still taking a little bit of time, but it definitely goes faster. What I would say is there's actually a lot of the interesting part is there's a lot of private sector technologies and things that even Microsoft is doing to speed it up before you even enter that process. There are some solutions that are can offer, they're kind of bundled around an ATO in a day type of process, and others that are looking at automating the identification of what your vulnerabilities are so you can get through FedRAMP faster. So there's almost this emerging tech economy popping up around FedRAMP in itself. The other thing I would say is if you are going to embark on that journey, talk to, and I'd be happy to introduce you to a number of technologies, not necessarily the big incumbent ones that have gone through it, but the ones where they had to go to their board, because they're VC backed, and say, I want $1 million to go through FedRAMP, and they go, what's FedRAMP? Have a conversation with them about how they successfully maneuvered that and managed that internally, because if you don't message it right before you start on that path, you'll have engineers revolt, you'll have the board question all of it. I wish I had a better answer, but...
So Microsoft, I'll speak about my team, the Azure Government Engineering Product Team, and we have a blueprint program. So really it was born out of the idea, how do we facilitate We've been working with FedRAMP from the inception. Now we are pushing out a new service every 37 hours. How do we shorten that life cycle? And we've shortened it quite a bit, I would say, from a year to 90 days, so where we can go from GA to FedRAMP approved. But also what we can do is build a ecosystem, a partner ecosystem, where our partners can benefit from all the ATO approvals that we've already gotten on our platform. So when they build their companies, they really only have this much left to do. And by the way, we have an ATO accelerator program to help you with ATO in the day, though I have not seen that. Maybe an interim ATO, provisional ATO, but we're still working really hard, and we put a lot of resources around it. And we're working with other companies who are automating this whole process.
I'll just throw out one quick comment, just kind of as a casual observer to this dynamic. It strikes me that competition is good, and that as there are more competitive alternatives at different classification level networks, as we've talked about, that will tend to generate pressure on the government to get more efficient, because there's better, faster, cheaper virtues if you can do that. When it's sort of a monopoly in a capability set, there's not quite as much pressure on the government to innovate its processes quickly. So I think I'm just kind of throwing this out there. You're welcome to disagree, but I think what's brewing is some positive directional kind of things strategically.
I'll just add one last thing is, especially for emerging technologies, if you do look at some of the things like OTAs and some of the more innovative procurement methodologies, then you are actually, they tend to waive some of the traditional requirements around the security, such as FedRAMP, and that allows you to at least get some prototypes in the door while you start working on that in parallel.
Yeah, I think we've seen that as well, where if you're talking to the mission folks versus the CIO shop, no offense to, we love CIOs, but they have a mission in mind, and that they are really steadfast at getting that technology to meet the mission needs. So they may accelerate that whole process, trying to get to their mission and goal. Any other questions? I'm closer.
Good evening. This question is for Colonel Robinson, and by extension to the rest of the panel. Once upon a time, at least I'm coming from the talent perspective. I graduated college about 10, 12 years ago now, and once upon a time, the government was the place to be if you wanted innovation. From the start of, I guess, the modern internet at ARPANET, at Pentagon, if you wanted to be at the bleeding edge of the space race, if you wanted to play with the hottest toys, airplanes, etc., you wanted to be in government. Our heroes were Buzz Aldrin, our heroes were Neil Armstrong. Not anymore. Our heroes now are, well, other than Hollywood celebrities, I guess I would say, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, mostly private. My question is, how do we bring that innovation mindset, that hero mindset back to government? Because over the last 10 years that I've worked with government, whenever I explain to my peers or I tell other people that I graduated with that I work with government, like, oh, okay, government is where talent goes to die. So where it used to be the other way, government was where heroes went to, be born. How do we bring that mindset back to the government? How do we make our institutions bring our institutions back to that place? I guess it's more of a philosophical question.
Yeah, I think one thought would be, don't think of it as a binary thing, right? Perhaps Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are superheroes supporting the DoD. They just happen to not wear a uniform like me, and everybody in here, while you may not be in the DoD, you are patriotic Americans trying to serve the national good, and do well from a business perspective in the meantime. So I don't think it has to be an either or. I mean, we were talking about talent acquisitions. There's an increasing appreciation for bringing in, I'll share a little bit about myself. So I'm a reservist. So I came on active duty for 1 year to serve in the Pentagon working for DIU. I'm a space and satellite and geospatial satellite person in my civilian job. And so, as a military reservist, it's one way that I can kind of be both. So I really don't think it has to be a binary decision anymore, in the least. And I think we're going to see some growth in that appreciation in creative programs like we talked about, HQEs, SGEs, DARPA fellows, Intergovernmental Personnel Act. You're seeing these things increase. So but I do take your point, and I do agree. It is not as it once was, right? This isn't the place to become a hero as it was, in the 50s and 60s.
Even though we're keeping our eye on future forces, so it seems like a very hero kind of thing to do. So, any other thoughts on this?
I mean, the only other quick thing from the Microsoft side, funny enough, our CEO Satya will have a quote where he'll say that you don't come to Microsoft in order to be cool. You actually come to Microsoft to help our customers look cool. And when you think a little bit about, not saying that government roles are not attractive or don't have that, but when we think of just what we wake up and you do and the value you bring to the mission, you're trying to keep our country safe. We're trying to provide value to the citizen when you're actually doing a tour inside of the government or just being a part of it. It's the same way in certain parts of the private industry as well. So it may not be a direct answer to bringing back the hero aspect of things, but just being able to take pride in what you do day in and day out has a lot of value at the end of the day.
Yeah, we could probably have a whole discussion about workforce culture. I think that could be a whole panel in itself. But yeah, my devil's advocate question is, does it need to be? Mostly because the government awarding a contract to a company, as an example, could single-handedly change the economy. So in some ways, DARPA and IARPA worked. They spun out some of the biggest companies that exist today back into the commercial industry, same with SBIR grants and things like that. So when the Air Force decides to engage with, SpaceX and leverage them and get things into outer space at a fraction of the cost, the question is, do we need to be able to do that as the government, or do we need to just be able to enable the contractual actions to allow the private sector to do that faster and more efficiently? Because you could change the entire economy if government is able to do that more efficiently. That's my thought.
So I want to say that the government is already full of heroes. What people aren't really great at is telling their story, because
very true.
So almost everybody who's working for the government is trying to do something that's good for someone or some large group of someone's, right? And it can be a slog, and it's a really hard thing to get through a lot of days, but they're not out there telling their story. Somebody who's bending over backwards to make sure a veteran is getting their health benefits. It's not a glamorous job, but in my opinion, that person is a hero. You don't know what they had to do and what hoops they needed to jump through to make sure that person got the benefits that they deserved for defending our country, but they are a hero, and they're not out there bragging about it. So I think if you look around inside of government, it is full of heroes.
So I made a gigantic faux pas. I mentioned some heroes, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and I meant to mention Bill Gates as well. So I'll add him to that list.
So on that note, I want to thank all our speakers and everybody who's here. We're all heroes in that we're participating in government, and big thanks to everyone on the panel. We really enjoyed the conversation. We have a little bit of networking left. Again, thank you for coming to this meetup. Our next one is in January on how to jumpstart your cloud adoption. So really getting to what we're talking about. How do you tackle and accelerate what you're doing? So thank you very much for attending. We look forward to seeing you in the new year.